Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Thank you. My job is to begin by introducing each of our speakers, who will speak for about 10 minutes and give us some thoughts to begin our conversation. Our first speaker this evening is Dr. Suzan Silby. She's the Leon and Anne Goldberg Professor of Humanities and Professor of Sociology and Anthropology. She's the recipient of numerous prizes and awards, including the Doctor Honoris Causa from the École Normale Supérieure Cachin in Paris. She's past president of the Law and Society Association and fellow of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. Dr. Silby received her PhD in political science from the University of Chicago, and she taught at Wellesley College for almost 25 years before joining MIT in 2000. She's written extensively about the social organization of the law in diverse settings, and her current research looks at scientific laboratories comparing the place of law in such expert communities and in popular culture. How do complex technological organizations observe and govern themselves, for example? How do they develop new safety regimes in research labs? She's completing a long-term study of engineering education, following a cohort of students through 4 different engineering schools and beyond into the workplace. It's a pleasure to introduce her. Let's welcome Professor Silby.
Thank you. I can't see anyone with these lights, and that might be a good idea, too. So, when asked to appear on this panel, I was given the topic, which was on the board before, Can Technology Save the World? My answer is an emphatic no. Technology cannot save the world. Technology cannot save the world because it is part of the problem. Specifically, technology is about the development and organization of technique, of methods of doing things, independent of the purposes of technique. Technology can serve many ends, purposes for which many of which are not intended and many of which are unanticipated and unpredicted. Technology cannot save the world because it cannot tell us what kind of world we would like to have, and thus whether that world is threatened or what saving would mean or involve. It can tell us under certain conditions may change, but not whether that is good or bad change. So in the time allotted to me, I'd like to see if I can take this sort of a slogan and turn it into a reasonable position with a little bit more nuance. For nearly 400 years now, from the publication, let us say, of Bacon's New Atlantis in 1627 to the present, we have seen a relentless, triumphant march of science and the increasing application of discoveries and inventions associated with science and engineering. Over these centuries, science and the technologies it has produced won the virtually unanimous support of both popular and learned opinion, until now, that is. In the early part of the 20th century and continuing to the present, skepticism about the merits of science began to attract the kind of attention that had been given to support and praise of science in the past. The chorus of adversary critique, of vocal and sometimes organized opposition to the advances of science and technology has grown considerably in volume, seriousness, and urgency over the 20th century and now into the 21st. Indeed, rather than technology saving the world, the critics suggest that technology is destroying the world. Now, there are 2 kinds of arguments that are usually offered for this position. One criticism concerns the direct impact, the negative impact of technology on the environment and on human health. And here we hear about the exhaustion of resources, pollution, diseases, injuries caused by industrial processes and products, and the deleterious effects of mechanization and automation on human mental health. The second argument proposes that the advances in technology cause a radical transformation in the nature of human existence, quite apart from the specific effects identified in the first argument, and possibly an unwelcome transformation of human life, even if we are to solve the problems of the first kind. And this is the basis of my position that I just announced, that technology cannot save the world. So allow me to explain these two different positions. Obviously, the first set of problems are more pressing. The depletion of stocks of fossil fuels, the ravages caused by carcinogens, the debilitating effects of oppressive industrial processes constitute an immediately felt burden of harm and cost. If we add to this global climate change, rising seas, melting ice caps, we are certainly facing changes that may transform the world in radical and unhappy ways. What do I mean by unhappy? In ways that make human lives more perilous, suffering, or in the words of the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes, nasty, brutish, and short. Even though controversies about resources, cancer, climate change, childhood allergies, and horrendous labor conditions pit advocates of technology and progress against people who favor its slowdown or even its halt, this is actually a debate that is internal to technology. The issues involve problems that are amenable to remediation, to be addressed and hopefully solved by the same kinds of methods that caused the problems in the first place. So let me be clear here and explicit, because this leads to the second argument against technology. That is, that the same kinds of mentality, the same kinds of logic, the same kinds of reasoning that devises the uses, let us say, for example, of asbestos in the first place, were also at work identifying its pathogenic consequences, and is at work to find and administer remedies for those, and to prevent them from reoccurring. Within this framework, then, the question is not whether we should, for example, employ techniques to fireproof schools, or genetically modify crops, or institute environmental safety precautions in laboratories, but whether we should let the technological progress stumble forward on a path strewn with casualties of its promoters' improvidence, opportunism, greed, or take charge of its course. I base my position that technology cannot save the world on the second argument, that technology causes a radical transformation in human existence quite apart from its specific events. I admit that this argument is a little bit lacks some of the specificity that identifies particular harms and practical implications. Here, the target of concern is the influence of technology on the conduct of life. And it is here where technology cannot save the world, because it has so transformed what we consider the world, how we talk about the world, what we think is human, and what we think is important about being human, that saving the world has become a technological question. And that is the problem which technology cannot solve. Let me put it another way. The transformation of the conduct of life involves a change in the ways we feel and think about ourselves as persons and how we live with one another. There is a fear in this second concern that the prevalence of technological hardware in our environment and of the technological mentality will lead to a form of human existence ordered in all important aspects by mechanical regulation, by calculation, by risk assessment, by quantifying all human activity, and as a consequence, regarding as important and relevant to human life only those aspects that can be quantified, or more specifically, attached a monetary value. Sometimes this second argument is presented as the loss of human autonomy, human agency, decision-making, replaced by robots and algorithms that channel options and choices on the basis of probabilistic mathematics and finely crafted silicon transits. This second argument posits that the prospects of human autonomy will or has already become uncertain. Now, we know, of course, that human autonomy has always been uncertain, so much so that it's almost a contradiction in terms. Human life and decision-making has and always will be constrained, limited, channeled by circumstances, by resources, capacities, and other conditions. Thus, the notion of the freedom or autonomy, such as the free market, is an ideological trope that masks as much as it reveals. It hides the constraints that are always present to emphasize the spaces which are always limited, as they are, for unconstrained human decision-making. This argument about human decision-making and autonomy also ignores the very fundamental human action that makes the algorithms, builds the robots. Just the other day, one of my friends at the university down the street told me that she was teaching a graduate seminar on the consequences of autonomous robots. "Why do you refer to them as autonomous?" I said. Of course, I know about drones, I know about computers that seem to learn, perhaps even like Watson, but human beings are building these. We are not yet living in a world where the robots energize themselves, design their own circuits without any human intervention. So this is not my concern. Human autonomy or robot autonomy is a spurious issue. The problem of technology is much, much simpler. It is about the way we think. Technology involves means-ends reasoning. It is the creation or design of pragmatic solutions to problems. Thus, the topic for tonight, can technology save the world? Can it solve our problem? To know that, we have to identify the problem. Technology cannot do that, cannot save the world, because it cannot identify the problem. Technology as a means-ends process cannot identify what is a good end, and that's why it cannot solve the world. Furthermore, technologies do not deploy themselves. It requires human decision-making, and that is not subject to perfect calculation, and that's why technology cannot solve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Silby. Our second speaker for this evening is Jose Gomez-Marquez. He is the Program Director for the Innovations in International Health Initiative at MIT, and he leads a multidisciplinary team of scientists to design medical devices for developing countries. He's the co-inventor of the Aerovax drug delivery system, a device for mass delivery of inhalable drugs and vaccines to promote populations, and the X-Out TB program, which aims to increase TB therapy adherence in developing countries using novel diagnostics and mobile technology. Recently, that group has developed the MediKit, a series of design building blocks that empower doctors and nurses in developing countries to invent their medical technologies. Jose serves on the European Union's Science Against Poverty Task Force and has participated as an expert advisor in the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. He's an instructor of MIT's D-Lab Health, a course on designing global health technologies at MIT. He is a 3-time MIT Ideas Competition winner, including 2 Lemelson Awards for International Technology. And in 2009, Jose was selected to Technology Review's T35, which also named him Humanitarian of the Year. In 2011, he was named a TED Fellow. Let us welcome Jose Gomez-Marquez.
Thank you very much, and good evening. I build gadgets. technologies that can hopefully save the world. We often joke in the lab that I don't think we have saved many patients or individuals yet, but we try. And I think this talk is mostly about how we try and how we recognize how the limits of our trying can inform our understanding of the limits of technology and the possibilities of accepting the reality of Jesus Christ as somebody who can save the world. What you see here are Lego blocks that we deploy to use as lab-on-chip platforms so that laboratory techs in the developing world can make their own diagnostics. We have things such as solar-powered autoclaves that can sterilize medical instrumentation in the middle of nowhere. Smart diagnostics that instead of saying yes and no, display encrypted codes so that tuberculosis patients can stay on their meds, and in return, we give them cell phone minutes. And little boxes filled with toys and prototyping kits so that nurses and doctors and healthcare workers in developing countries and in our own country can come up with their own ideas about what medical technology should be, instead of relying on what we often come up with at MIT and other places in the developed world that we think ought to be. And this takes me to my first point, which is traditionally we think of technology to save the world, or technology to affect the world in any way, as being best brought by those experts sitting in places like our institution, coming up with all sorts of different ideas, whether it's space robots or nanotechnology or quantum physics, that then we just deploy to the world. It's our gift to the world, our export, if you will. And largely, we see the fruits of that. The computers that we use, the gadgets that we wake up to and go to sleep with are often the result of those efforts and efforts of people like ourselves and what you may do with your own careers. We try to take that a second step, and when we go to a developing country, we realize that we lack that type of brain trust that we enjoy over here and the resources that we could deploy otherwise. And we often end up in places like this, where there is simply nothing. There is no inspiration, there is no lab, there is no capital equipment. And instead, we run into people's own idealized view of what their inventive possibilities are. And in their world, what I find when I go down there is that they have no problem accepting their own limits and of accepting that even though they can also come up with ideas, their brain trust often becomes a prayer to find inspiration, to come up with a better idea. And it's not a mark of their limits, it's a mark of their possibilities. The Bible tells us that because as He is, so we are in this world. And that means that if they believe that, their impact on the world can become just as big as God's impact on the world. And I'm actually a technology optimist. I think we've all seen graphs like this, where technology is just on this exponential ride where we can all collect the jetpacks at the end of this evening and fly off into outer space. And there's wonderful quotes. Niels Bohr said, technology has advanced more in the last 30 years than in the previous 2,000, and the exponential increase. And I think every 10 years somebody else comes up with a better version of that quote. What I find when we go down to places in the developing world where there is poverty and suffering and challenges is that largely it's often not about the gadget and it's not about the technology. It's actually a lot of other things that matter. And one of those things that we look for is insight. Insight to develop new technologies is often, at least for me as a Christian, inspired by the example that Jesus gave when He walked on this earth, because He taught us to care. He taught us to look at the lowest common denominator of a population and care about that population instead of just hanging out with high-end intellectuals who would parse the nuances of the Old Testament. He cared about people who hadn't even read the Old Testament, and he made a difference. And experiments that take that insight out of a society and the insight that the reality of Jesus can affect a society have proven to be failures. You can, throughout history, you can see many forms of societies where it tried to take that away from societies, or try to take the possibilities of a belief in the Christian faith outside, and more often than not, they struggle. But often they endure and they come back stronger. And it's never about the gadget. It's about the insight. The other thing that we often recognize is that it's less about the hardware and it's more about the intangible. And so the charts that I showed previously, which show that, hardware and technology and gadgetry is advancing at an ever-increasing pace, are all true, and the statistics are there. But when we look at our own lives, that chart doesn't look like that at all. And when we look at our parents' lives and our grandparents' lives, the chart is more about a series of oscillations, of ups and downs. And what I find as I lead my life as a scientist is that Jesus talked about that, and he predicted that that's exactly what's going to happen. And he said, you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. In other parts, it says you will walk through the valley of death. It's not a matter of if, it's about when. But there are answers to that. And then finally, what we find is that largely it's about hope. For those individuals that don't have the brain trust, that don't have the resources to find out how to solve these problems, it's less about the intellectual challenge of our own experiments, where if we run up against a wall, we can often chalk it up to, well, science will take care of it in the next generation. Because for those nurses and for those patients and doctors in the developing world and in other places where suffering and poverty are a reality, it isn't very much about them and about the now and about what can we solve. And hope cannot be manufactured. But there is a certain confidence in knowing that at a certain point you don't have the answers, but you make a very determined choice to rely on something bigger than yourself. And in my life, that's exactly how I conduct my own professional challenges. I think on paper, I'm woefully underqualified for what I do, hence I use toys. But when we go down to the places where we try to make an impact, I always remind ourselves that it's really not about what I can do. It's about what the God that I believe in can do it through me. And in the end, you'll make up your own mind about Jesus and technology, and about its ability to have an impact in the world or not, and the impact and the ability of other institutions that matter perhaps more than what you may think of your own belief systems. But to be sure, one of the things that will immediately crystallize your conviction about your position will be when saving the world is really about saving yourself. And in my case, as a Christian, I witness how technology and medical professions and the medical sciences gave me a very low score of surviving a complicated premature birth, oxygen loss, cognitive impairment predictions, and my parents, my family had a choice. They could believe medical science and they could believe the best gadgets that were available in Honduras at the time, or they could believe what a hopeful group of believers in the Christian faith held to be true, which is that Jesus came to heal and to solve the intangible and to have a belief not in the powers of the experts, but in a higher power. And when your own life is on the line that often gets blurred between the satisfaction of solving it on your own and the satisfaction of just having somebody solve it for you becomes very, very real. And that's why, as a Christian, I believe that technology can get us very, very far, but not far enough without my Christian beliefs. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jose. Our third speaker for this evening is Dr. George Barbastathis, a professor of mechanical engineering at MIT and faculty resident with the Singapore MIT Alliance for Research and Technology SMART Center. He received the Diploma in Electrical and Computer Engineering from the National Technical University of Athens and the MSc and PhD in Electrical Engineering from Caltech. He was then a postdoctoral associate with the Beckman Institute at the University of Illinois, and next was a visiting scholar at the School of Engineering and Applied Science up the street, Harvard University. He's been the recipient of the Nikolaos Kritikos Award in Mathematics, the 3M Innovation Award, the NSF Young Investigator Award, the Esther and Harold E. Edgerton Jr. Chair at MIT. He's a fellow of the Optical Society of America, and he and his team at the SMART Center developed an invisibility cloak using a very simple and inexpensive system. This method of using science to hide objects in plain sight was voted in the top 10 breakthroughs in physics in 2010. He's not a Klingon, but let's welcome Professor Barbastathis.
Thank you, Ian, for the introduction. Before I tell you what I think about the question we're discussing tonight, I'll start by telling you a little bit about what I do. And of course, I will not get technical. That's not the point today. But I'll tell you that I work with light, as you gathered from the description. In my group, we do a lot of work that utilizes light, not only for invisibility cloaking. Actually, that was a very small part of what we do, and I think it got some disproportionate publicity. But we do actually quite a bit of useful work using in things like microscopy and imaging at various distances. Microscopy, typically you image at near distances. We do work on imaging at intermediate distances and far away. And so our purpose in using light is basically to enable other colleagues, scientists, to understand better either nature for their purposes of explaining certain phenomena, or to create devices where light can be used. So, for example, we do some work with colleagues in biology and bioengineering who use our instruments that we develop in order to understand disease and perhaps develop better therapies and better cures. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because light is a wonderful thing. It is very elusive, as you can see. I'm lit at the moment, you can see me, but it's not something that you can touch or you can very easily grasp what is happening. We can, of course, model it with equations, but it's not something that we can touch and feel very easily, except when it makes us hot. And that is magnificent. That is really actually what attracted me to the field of optics. And there's all kinds of other wonderful things. For example, we study the structure of the human eye. That is really a magnificent optical instrument. It makes you ponder how it could possibly be developed. And so the kind of work we do really makes you think very deeply about nature. So it is a wonderful science, if you wish. But it's also very useful because if you look around you, it is not just the light bulbs. There's all kinds of devices that utilize light to bring better results to you, whether it is the optical fibers that bring information to your home, or the various technologies that your doctor uses in order to diagnose if something is wrong with you, and so on. So my point is that technology actually can produce some wonderful things for you, but there's also no doubt, as our first speaker pointed out very, very aptly, that also technology can do some awful things for you. Whether it is deliberate, for example, weapons that can kill and spread diseases and so on, or it is not really deliberate, it is unintended consequences that change our environment due to the ways we use technology, either because we don't know or because we deliberately forget about the possible effects that our use of technology can create. So I would like to take the thesis, actually, that technology, it may be a cliche, but technology cannot by itself make you better or worse. It is actually yourself who can make you better or worse, depending on how you use it. And I have two specific, actually, suggestions, if you wish, for how technology can be helpful. One of them is, in my opinion, that technology and science should be open. And what I mean by open is free to distribute and free to comprehend for anyone who wishes or is curious enough to comprehend them. And this is actually something that, without specifically quoting, I was inspired to say that by MIT's former president, Professor Chuck Vest, who is now president of the National Academy of Engineering, who back then in the days of very soon after September 11, was advocating that even with the threat of terrorism, we should still actually have open access to scientific publications. And now this issue actually has come up very strongly again because the government tried to stop publication of certain biological research on the basis that it may be used for weapons, for biological terrorism. And so the argument here is actually that openness cannot hurt in the long run, because usually the bad guys who try to use technology for bad means deliberately, they're actually far behind, far less advanced than the good guys like ourselves, hopefully, who, if we get access to all these publications, we can actually develop means to stop the bad guys. So we can always stay one step ahead of them, or more than one step ahead of them, provided we have open access. So that's one thesis that I believe is very important in understanding how technology can change things. The second, which is equally important but perhaps more relevant to a broader class of people, is that technology requires informed use. And actually that is very significant now, because technology is accessing bigger and bigger parts of the global population, and it is not clear that everybody is informed on what the gadgets that they're using, what these gadgets can do for them or against them. And of course, everybody tries to inform people, but of course, as you know, every time you pick up a new gadget at Best Buy or whatever, how often do you really read the manual? I know that those of you who happen to be students in MIT engineering, you don't. And that's also the case for me until I get into trouble. But that's actually important, read the manual. And not only that, but what's also important is who wrote the manual. Because what someone discloses to you about technology and about its possible uses is, of course, very controlled by the people who developed it. And what you can do with technology then becomes an issue of judgment for you, for the people who develop the technology, and for the intermediaries who actually sold it or advertised it or promoted it for you. Now, the next question comes, how do you judge how to use technology? The classical ethical question here is, much of the research supported at MIT and most other universities is actually funded for military purposes. And, well, one can argue that this is good because it promotes defense, but also we know that, with technology we can kill people. And typically this is done by militaries in the larger scale. So should we do it or should we not do it? And I think there's many answers to that question. I think since this forum is sponsored by Veritas, I would like to take a rather controversial position and say that, in fact, we can actually come up with rules and guidelines for how to make ethical use of technology without having to resort to a divine being. And the reason I'm saying that is because it is very easy, actually, to tell someone, well, if you do something bad, God will punish you. But I think, and without entering the question of whether God is there to punish you in the first place, it still seems to me that it is a little bit demeaning to tell someone that, because it seems to me that as humans, we should have the decency, the very basic fundamental decency to decide what is good to do to each other, whether we use technology or not. And that, of course, applies even in societies where technological use is very low, provided we have some sort of basic education and some sort of basic covenant in the community which guides behavior. And technology is very much a part of this covenant, whether you use it for a good purpose that you can help your fellow human being, or whether you can actually use it to inflict some terrible harm upon them. And it even guides the use of technology when it comes to unintended consequences, because the same covenant can actually guide you to decide how much you are going to research into the possible outcomes of your creation, of your invention, to the degree that you can, to the degree that you can anticipate. Of course, you can never anticipate everything, but you can try pretty hard with the help of background science that we have available nowadays, and also with the help of other colleagues. So I would like to take the thesis that, well, I don't know to what degree the world needs saving, but I would like to take the thesis that technology can indeed solve some very important problems that we face as humans, and it can do it very successfully if we can agree to have a decent behavior between ourselves as human beings. Thank you.
Our final speaker for this evening is Dr. Rosalind Picard, no relation to Jean-Luc. She's founder and director of the Affective Computing Research Group at the MIT Media Laboratory and co-director of the Things That Think Consortium. She's also co-founder, chairman, and chief scientist for the MIT spin-out company Affective. Picard also co-directs the MIT Autism and Communication Technology Initiative. She's the author of over 200 peer-reviewed scientific articles in multidimensional signal modeling, computer vision, pattern recognition, machine learning, and human-computer interaction. She's known internationally for pioneering research in affective computing, and prior to that, research in content-based image and video retrieval. She is a graduate with highest honors from the Georgia Institute of Technology and holds master's and doctorate degrees in electrical engineering and computer science from MIT. Professor Picard is an active inventor, and her group's inventions have twice been named to the top 10 lists, including the New York Times Magazine's Best Ideas of 2006 for their social cue reader, used in autism, and 2011 Popular Science Top 10 Inventions for a mirror that monitors vital signs. Let's welcome Professor Picard.
Picard to the bridge. Okay. Get the head shaved here. Okay. What are the world's hardest problems, and what is the promise of technology to solve them? One of the biggest problems I work on is inventing technology to try to help people who live with autism. I get a lot of email from parents of children on the autism spectrum who hear about my group's work and write me for help. I want to read a short excerpt from one. It kind of reminded me when I saw the subject line of the old Dear Abby column, because the title in the subject was Desperate Father. Dear Professor, my colleague told me about a new fascinating technology he heard on BBC Radio 4. I have an 8-year-old son who is diagnosed with ASS. Unfortunately, I only know the Dutch term, but in English, it must be something like autism spectrum disorder. In general, he is a normal, intelligent boy. Autism is the last thing that comes into mind when you see him. But sometimes, he starts disturbing the classroom or responds too aggressive against other children. It's his 3rd year in school, and he is already in his 3rd school. For the moment, he is going to a special school for children with learning disorders, but things still do not go as expected. We are going from one test center to another for 4 years now, and the pressure on our family is really hard. So I asked my colleague the details of the radio program, and he directed me to the recording. When I listened to the recording, I had to pause it halfway through as I was getting too emotional. I believe this technology can help us in important ways. Knowing the moments of fear, anger, concentration, he goes on, would be very useful as my son does not always recognize these feelings with him correctly. For example, we discovered lately that when he is hungry, he becomes aggressive without knowing he is hungry. Here I'll move ahead. The father goes on to describe how he went to our web pages where we had open sourced and put out descriptions for our technology, hoping people could use it for free. And he says, I can imagine that you receive many similar requests from parents for help and that you cannot respond to all of them. I found a lot of information on the FAQ pages, but although I have some experience with electronics, I do not see it feasible to build this device from scratch. Parts were changing, all this other stuff. Is there any way for me to cooperate in a test program, or is there anything similar commercially available? We would really appreciate your help. Again, my son is an intelligent child, and this could be decisive for his school career. Who knows what contribution he can make back towards science in the future? Signed, Desperate Father. The technology we invented at MIT reads some of the emotional information this boy needs help with, and it has now become commercially available. I'm wearing one version of part of it tonight, the Q sensor made by Affective. Full disclosure, I'm co-founder, chief scientist, chairman of the board. This technology is starting, and they're for sale, I'm supposed to, but we're not selling them here. That's not the topic tonight. Okay. This technology, however, is starting to make a difference in people's lives. Today, it's also enabling scientists and clinicians to do new research in epilepsy to detect seizures and the intensity of the seizure, in PTSD, and helping desensitize people with phobias, and helping people better understand anxiety disorders, and even in some new studies looking at what precedes cravings and the stress that may overcome people when they're struggling through treatment with drug addiction. Years ago, here in Kresge, actually, we used a predecessor of this technology to measure audience responses. Instead of seeing these blinding lights and black behind them, I saw the audience light up with the brightness of the LED when one of the main signals that we're measuring went up. It went up, in fact, every time there was a live demonstration, and the audience glowed. And every time there was live interaction, a live Q&A session, the audience glowed. It went up with each new speaker, and it went up with laughter. However, unfortunately, we also learned that with every PowerPoint presentation, it went down with a decaying exponential. This technology has great uses, whether for entertainment, for medical, lots of uses, but it does not save the world. What if it were so good that it could completely eradicate a condition such as autism? It cannot do that. But if we could invent a technology to wipe out a serious condition, would we want to do that? One of the things I have learned from people on the autism spectrum is that we have to be very careful and humble when we think we know what is best, especially when it involves another human life. We often fall short in our knowledge of what is best. For example, as I've gotten to know many people with autism, I have learned that many of them don't want to be cured of autism. Many of them who cannot even speak will type, "I don't want a cure, I just want tools that help me to adapt to my world and learn from it. I may have more trouble with it, but I still just want help. I don't want you to get rid of me." They don't want a new genetic test, a new technology that makes them detected before birth and likely to be aborted. That doesn't save anyone. It certainly doesn't help save the world. I'm hard-pressed and challenge you. Can you think of any technology that has never caused at least some serious problems, even if overall one might argue it has made the world better? I love my MacBook, but sometimes it malfunctions, and it's probably going to wind up in a landfill someday. Wireless mobile technologies are bringing better health and learning to our brothers and sisters in very poor and rural communities, but but they're also allowing terrorists to make a phone call and detonate a bomb. I think vaccines make our world better, but they've also inadvertently killed people. Technology does not ultimately save our lives, even if it lengthens our life. We're all going to die. I'd love to invent a technology that provides world peace. There's a big problem. But what technology could prevent evil people from seeking power and domination over others? Now, my team here builds technology that detects and analyzes emotion. Maybe we could help people regulate emotion, or maybe we could rid the world of war-prompting emotions like anger. Imagine. But once again, we have to question that we have imperfect knowledge. For example, what we think of as bad emotions are not all bad. I don't know how many of you were here at commencement years ago when Lee Iacocca spoke at MIT graduation. It was a really gorgeous sunny day. The grass was green, the sky was blue. The students were so happy to finally be graduating. The parents were so happy to finally not have to pay bills. The flowers were blooming, and Lee Iacocca got up at the podium and he banged his fist on it. I can't do it as loud as he did there. Maybe he had the microphone on the podium. And he said, "You must get angry. You must get angry." And he told all the graduates, "You must get angry." And they're kind of like looking at each other like, who hired this guy to wreck our day, you know? But why was he saying this? Because anger is not all bad, right? What we think of sometimes as bad with our imperfect knowledge can be good. Anger is a great motivator. It prompts you to stop putting up with a lot of the garbage out there and make something that is better. A technology that got rid of anger would also get rid of much of the good changes in our world. It would not save the world. What are sources of hope beyond technology? What does it mean to save the world, really? I mean, more specific, what does it mean to even save one person, you or me? Here at MIT, we look to knowledge and great achievements to save oneself, to make a better world. But is that enough? I don't think it is. There was a time when Germany had many of the finest scientists, technologists, doctors, well-educated scholars in the world, even social covenant and a contract, a very civilized society. They had brilliant achievements, and yet this well-educated, successful populace came to believe that a man, their leader, could save their nation by getting rid of what he convinced them was bad and promoting what he convinced them was good. This man did not submit to any greater authority. He scoffed at the idea that he should submit to God. Der Führer was the ultimate authority, and he required not only the armed forces to swear allegiance to him, but also German pastors to swear allegiance to him. You know his name, Adolf Hitler. Putting oneself on the ultimate throne of authority, claiming to know how to save a nation is not a one-time tragedy. We've seen it repeatedly. Stalin, Lenin, Mao, Pol Pot, just a few of the names that have illustrated what happened when somebody thought they knew what was best. And these individuals used technology to murder hundreds of millions of innocent people. Evidence shows repeatedly that when we try to save ourselves by being great, we fail. We can never be as good as we think we could be. We all fall short, myself included. Like most students who come to MIT, I had straight A's, #1 in high school, #2 Georgia Tech, 5.0 PhD, course 6 here at MIT, some of the best friends a person could ask for, dated the cutest guys on the football team, high school. I'm blessed with loving parents. On the faculty at MIT, I made it from the bottom all the way through tenure and promotion as full professor. I have a husband who is also an MIT Course 6 alum. We met in the computer room on a Friday night, he reminded me. You might want to go to one after this event. He is amazing, married to me for 23 years, deserving of great respect and admiration. We have 3 loving sons, truly the best boys on the planet. I'm not biased. In research, I've received thousands of citations, hundreds of keynote invitations. Gratified to know my work has helped other people. I feel, enormously blessed by much of this, and it brings me great joy. But you know what? All of this worldly success, it pales completely in comparison to the greatest thing in my life. Knowing and being known by the one who made it all, the one from whom every good thing comes, the one who knows what the world truly needs to be saved, the one who knows and loves every single person on our planet, you and me included, whether or not we behave in a lovable way, whether we respond with love in return, or whether we spit in return. None of my achievements, none of the generous gifts I've been given, even begin to compare with experiencing the abundant peace, mercy, grace, joy, healing, strength, and more when we but open our hands to receive these gifts. That gift giver, I believe, is the greatest hope and saving influence. Don't get me wrong, I still fall short, but my life is so much improved, so much more abundant, filled with peace for having taken myself off the throne of thinking what is best that I could know and make those perfect decisions. You can experience this too, but you would also have to be willing to put one in charge of your life who knows how to run it better than you do. To conclude, I want to build great technology to help our world, and I want to give of whatever I have to help people in need, whether they have autism, epilepsy, a lack of ability to speak, or some other challenge that we might invent new technology to help. I delight in this work. But an even greater delight, the deepest I have ever experienced, is in knowing and being known by the ultimate source of all knowledge, power, mercy, strength, and goodness. This is the knowledge of the one who loves every person on the planet, the one who truly saves the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our speakers. And now I'm going to invite all of the four speakers to come up and join me on the stage. We're going to move into a more conversational style. There's going to be an opportunity for you to ask questions and for the panel to ask questions of one another. Probably I'll kick it off with a few questions, but feel free to text or Twitter your questions. There's going to be technology that's going to save this presentation. I have it in my hand, and so please, panel, do join me, and let's sit. So the general idea is that when you have texted your questions in, they're going to appear on this marvelous gadget that I have in front of me. But I wanted to ask one of the panelists to give a sort of direct answer to one of the direct questions. And if one of you wants to jump in, what's your definition or vision of an ideal world?
Can't be answered in 2 minutes.
Does that mean you're passing on the question, or are you just saying it? Would you like to offer us a minute or two?
I suggest we read some political philosophy. There have been a lot of ideal worlds proposed throughout history. So you want me to repeat the history of political philosophy for 3,000 years? There's Plato's vision of an ideal world where philosophers would rule.
No, but Susan,
Locke's
the question is, what is your vision, not
I don't
what is everybody
believe
else's
in the
vision?
ideal. I believe in the real.
Okay.
Ideals don't get us very far.
Okay. Anyone else want to pitch in on this one?
Sometimes these ideal... I think sometimes these ideal worlds turn out to be horrible dystopias, don't they? So maybe it's better if we don't have them at all.
Well, if that's the case, and I'll pick up one of the first questions I've got on my pad here. How do we determine good ends to seek after?
Through conversation. Through conversation with other people. By being, as George said, decent to each other. By listening. By having open discourse. That's how we determine it. Now, that isn't the way it's done, but that would be a better way to do it.
So how do we come to agreement on this? It's just a continuous process of conversation.
That's right.
I agree.
Or you could take a gun.
That assumes that we have the knowledge and the answers, though.
No, it assumes that collectively we can come to an agreement about how we can live with each other. That's what it assumes. Not that there's an answer going to come from something, I don't know what.
Okay, so we have to generate. So we have one view which says we're essentially going to generate our answers through a conversation, through a just a process. Does that process, is that process itself a good?
That's what most democratic theorists think, that the process, if it's participatory and open and egalitarian, that is the good, the best that we can hope for human existence. It's never existed except in very small, very rare moments in history, but there is no alternative.
So we were discussing at dinner before the meeting to the question of whether democracy is of itself sort of an ultimate good. Susan's kind of offered us a suggestion that maybe it is.
But don't let's get confused when I say democracy that way with any state or nation that now exists on the earth.
Yeah, I understand. Okay. I understand. There is no such thing as a perfect democracy.
I said
well, okay, so let me finish this person's question. How do we determine good ends to seek after, or has technology already affected our thinking too much for us to decide this? Or given the lack of international agreement on even the most basic questions of ethics, how should agreement on human decency be achieved? I think we've had an answer which says by conversation. I think Roz or maybe Jose, you might take a different view? Take the same view?
Conversation can lead you to places where fantastic technologies for destruction can thrive as well. I think it's not just about the conversation. It can be about the underlying technology, which other people will say it's about the underlying intent. And if those intents have ill will or are not guided by some fundamental belief in just doing good to others, it can do fantastic innovative destruction. Mm-hmm. So it's not just, I don't think that just having a conversation alone.
Yeah, I would add to it, the content of the conversation, I think, needs to, hopefully include those who might understand and have knowledge of all the ways people would be impacted by the technology and can act in a loving way toward them. And I would add, from a Christian standpoint, have value for all the lives, hold an equal value.
It's not only Christians who believe that human beings have value. I'm a complete atheist. I wouldn't go kill anybody. And I don't think other people should. You don't have to be a Christian to not hurt people.
In fact, I know many Christians who bring their guns to church.
The name of Christianity has killed millions of people over history. It doesn't guarantee a good ending. Just look at the history of the Catholic Church.
I didn't say it did, and certainly a lot of horrible things have been done in the name. One of the interesting things about the name of Christianity is pretty much anybody can adopt it, right? You don't have to get a PhD from a top institute to claim, like the gates to be calling yourself a scientist are pretty high, but anybody can call themselves a Christian whether they are or not and claim to do quite wrong things under that banner.
And do you think that the people who did wrong things under the name of Christianity, like the popes, over, shall we say, 1,000 years, they did not believe in Jesus Christ? You're now saying that they did not? They didn't put the people on the stake?
It's not just about believing.
So what is it then? How do you know? I say I don't know. I have to see it. I have to have empirical evidence that somebody else can see. This is a table. He can do it with optics. Tell me how you know. If it's not about science and empirical observation, how do you know? And how am I to know that what you know is right?
But you've been one of the advocates for a view very eloquently that technology cannot define its own ends.
That's correct.
And that presumably extends to science being unable to define its own ends.
And that's why I suggested conversation.
But don't you think that your position has actually turned around on itself?
No.
If you're insisting on tangible evidence for everything, isn't that going to lead us to a situation in which science and technology define what is ethical rather than something else? Isn't that going to happen?
No. Tangible evidence when you claim to know better, not when where there are things we cannot know about, and then we'll have to decide on some grounds of consensus. That's different than claiming to know.
Okay.
Consensus is not the same as claiming to know.
Okay. Anyone
That's
else want to
claiming an
jump in on this?
agreement.
You were in the middle of saying something and you were slightly interrupted, so you wanted to take it
didn't
up.
want to take over from you. I think, you have to think, even as a scientist, when you know something, what are the parts of that process of knowing? And, if somebody, for some reason, physically can't see that table or can't feel it, they can still know of its existence and, through some other sensory or other mechanisms. There's ultimately, all scientific knowledge is subject to our experience of something. And one can know what one believes, even if it's not a tangible, physically tangible thing, through experience of that thing. It may be through mechanisms that science has yet to show us how to measure.
If I may add something to that, it seems to me that science is, of course, very much about observation and experience, but it's also about logic, reason. And I think where I agree very much with Suzan, even though we took kind of opposite positions on the stage, is that science and technology, they proceed by observation, explanation, rejection, and repeat. So what I mean by rejection is once a scientific theory is proven to contradict logic in some way, then people discard it and move on. And of course, knowledge, like you said, becomes something very relative, because what physicists knew before 1905 turned out to be completely wrong. They knew it, but it was wrong. But I don't think this is what we're discussing here. I think what we're discussing here is how do we decide what we do to another human being is good or not. And even more so, if we create a device that may have some bad effect, how can we know it ahead of time? So the sad answer to that, I'm afraid, is that we don't. We can try our best to come up with an answer. I'm afraid the divine being cannot help us, at least in the history of the world. The divine being, which is called different things by different religions, all of them are correct, of course, or they claim to be correct, it has provenly failed to save millions of people, both from technology and from the things that other human beings did to them using this technology. So I don't know if overall the cumulative result of this design being was positive or negative, but certainly seems to me incapable of stopping deleterious effects. So I find it hard to believe, for that reason, that it should therefore be capable of saving us from its deleterious effects.
So Jose, you spoke to this a little bit in your 10-minute, this question of what it involves for people in countries which don't have high technology, how they perceive value, how they are, if you like, perceiving what it means to be saved. Would you like to develop that in relationship to what George has said?
I see your point. A lot of people look at the big picture of what in the final analysis has religion or my belief or in some deity done for the world. And it's difficult to find a tally on an almanac or a statistical proof that shows it. But when you talk to people one by one, and if you talk to enough people, you realize that in their life, it's a very real impact. And sometimes they can prove it, and sometimes they can show it, whether it's an improved in an improved lifestyle or a change in their family. But what I find is that it's always a matter of one by one, because that's the way I see it, how God actually intervenes. It's one by one because it's a personal choice. And we find evidence of that all over the world. And otherwise you wouldn't have millions of people believing in the same thing without that daily incentive, knowing that there is an effect in believing.
But is it really the same thing? Because I thought you argued that it is one by one, so each person has his or her own interpretation of how the divine being intervened in their lives. So is it then the same divine being?
I didn't say
everybody has a
interpretation.
personal God?
I didn't say interpretation. I said that it is a one by one experience. We can have different experiences in the same interpretation of what caused that experience, but even though they're fundamentally different, because you'll have your challenges and I'll have my own.
Okay, I'm going to ask a different question out off the technology, okay? Who should regulate the use of technologies? The government or the people, or maybe someone else? What qualifies someone to be an expert in technology and make those judgments? Who would like to tackle that one? Who should regulate the use of technologies, or how should we regulate them in our society?
Well, I'll take a shot at it first.
Yeah.
Again, I will argue that technology should be decided by consensus and basic decency between human beings, especially when this technology can have obvious binary effects. For example, the virus that can be used to perhaps study some disease, or it can be unleashed to kill millions of people in the water system or something like that. So some cases are very obvious like that, some cases are more subtle, but it seems to me that, again, in a purely secular way, using commonly agreed ethics, people can come to reasonable agreements on the regulation of technology. Of course, I realize that this is perhaps very idealistic, and reality does not work like that because of corporate interests or other factors that come into play. But I would like to think that as human beings, we can have enough decency to arrive to this.
So where does this decency come from? I find it interesting. I mean, essentially, you're advocating what I think Christians would say is love, okay, as being the guiding principle.
Yes.
And I think we would probably all, pretty much agree on that. The trick is, though, how on earth does that get implemented in practice? Isn't that the difficulty?
I think atheists can feel love. I'm an atheist, but I can also feel love. Hard as this might be for you to believe.
Of course you can. But the question is, how do we regulate or control or direct technologies as a society? And
That's a political process. That's what he said. Are you suggesting that we sit back and let a divine being regulate technology? I mean, what's the alternative if we don't do it? What's the other case? What's the counterfactual?
I don't think anybody has suggested that. I think that part of what may be important is that it not just be a government that do the regulation, but that we maybe use technology to involve the people quite broadly in the process of expressing dissenting views and helping inform the people who are making the decisions.
And are there many people here who would argue otherwise? Are there many people here in this community who would advocate some all-powerful, narrow oligarchy-run things? I mean, who are we arguing against?
Oh, I thought I just heard you say it was the political process. So I thought
well,
that
is a political process always oligarchic?
Well, in some countries.
Well, I said here.
Yeah, but we happen to have a political system that we like, okay? But there are plenty of other countries that
entirely.
don't have political systems that they like, okay? So just to say it's the political process doesn't seem to answer anything, okay?
But political process, politics, is the ways in which people decide how they should live. That's all. So this is one kind, democracy. Aristocracy is another kind. Oligarchy is another kind.
And those are all good?
No.
So some are good and some are bad. So how do we decide which are good and which are bad?
Which political process? That's what I told you, to read political philosophy. I mean, you're asking me for,
Okay, fine. Let's keep moving. Okay. If technology cannot save the world, what will?
Only people.
Only people?
Well, what does the world need to be saved from? Perhaps we should answer that.
Well, I know one thing it needs to be saved from, is climate, rising temperature and rising seas. I think we need to do something about that.
So global climate change, it needs to be saved from.
And it's not going to happen too soon.
Is there a way we can
Not
do
in
that?
the next 50 years, but we have to start now.
Okay. What else might the world need to be saved from? Any other remarks from the panel? Yeah.
Disease and unequal distribution of that technology.
Okay.
I think that
The political process is one way of solving it, but you find in many parts of the world people are completely disenfranchised from the political process. And there's, in fact, technologies that enable that disenfranchisement. It's part of the political machine, in fact, to just leave entire parts of the world out of that conversation. And tackling that very access to things that can improve their lives is one thing that we can tackle. But in answering that question, I think we find that we often are just powerless against that.
Okay. But in the end, isn't it, again, the people who deploy this technology, and they can choose where they use it, for example, to improve climate conditions by greening factories and by trying the best we can at this point, as opposed to spewing more carbon or drilling in Alaska or in Antarctica? So.
Well, let's not sound Pollyannish. When I say political process, I don't necessarily mean we have the channels in our current political structure to do so. There is a great disproportion of access. You asked for what one would like. I said participatory democracy. We don't have it. We have a highly skewed system at present, but it is a political process. That means a process where people need to participate and decide how we shall live together and how to solve these things. At the moment, it's strongly skewed in favor of corporate interests, very wealthy persons who have a disproportionate control over the technologies that were created for communication.
I think what I'm hearing is, in some cases, we also need to be saved from the political process.
There is no alternative,
and
is
from
what
the
I'm
people
saying.
who
There
make
is
the
no
mistakes.
alternative. I'm asking you for tell me the alternative to a political process. I don't know what
Well, I
the
think many of us
alternative is.
might think that the political process needs some other input than just the
Exactly.
political process itself
People.
in order to guide it, okay?
People.
Well, that's one answer, okay?
Oh, and yours is this coming from somewhere else.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that just to answer people says very little. People have to make decisions. Those decisions have to be based on some kind of ethical code, and the guidance for that ethical behavior, which George has advocated so
Decency.
clearly.
Decency.
Well, yeah, okay. These are kind of
Love
words
thy
which
neighbor as
are
you would love
very
yourself.
are very important and very and
Love thy
something
neighbor
which
as you would love
something
thyself.
we would all agree on. After all, the codes that you're offering are those of
There are also
of
a
religion.
few other philosophers since then. Let's take Kant, for example. The imperative, the categorical imperative is the same thing. Don't have to believe in Jesus to believe that one ought not to do damage to another human being.
Of course not.
Okay, so then we're in agreement. We're in heated agreement.
I would actually one more thing to people. I would add that the free flow of information is critical because the participatory democracy has one possible flaw, and that is an uninformed electorate. Would you like uninformed people to decide about details of the law? And so
That's a very important point, and you're right.
So let
Thank
me
you.
broaden that question then. Is it ever appropriate for some kind of extra scientific ethics to dictate to science or technology what it should or should not develop? For example, and let's take a hot button issue, stem cells. Could it be appropriate? I don't want you to answer the question of whether you are in favor or against, certain types of stem cell research. But do you think that it would, in fact, be appropriate for there to be some religious or ethical justification for forbidding technology from undertaking that type of research? Because this is, in a certain sense, in contrast to the openness question. That's why I'm asking it.
Yeah, quite the opposite, in fact. I think what needs to be regulated is the conduct of scientists, which is very well self-regulated in most cases. When misconduct happens, typically the scientific community corrects it. And what also needs to be perhaps not regulated is the open flow of information so that people, not only the scientists, but also the lay people, then they can understand what are the consequences of the scientific idea that has just been addressed or the technology that has been developed. As long as these are out and open for everybody to access, I think science can progress based on its own self-regulation. without this sort of superior force.
So your answer is science and technology should regulate itself. Do you agree with that?
Not always, but I don't like going down the path of saying you can't do research on certain topics if it can be governed. Governed doesn't mean prohibited. Regulation doesn't mean prohibition. It means, can it be confined, observed, see what the consequences are, stop action, take precautionary principles if necessary, but I'm not necessarily going to say absolutely you can't do stem cell research.
Roz, you got an answer on that?
I would repeat some of the things I've already said on that.
And jump in?
I think that it's a reasonable argument. My concern always becomes, at what point, who decides who's qualified and who's qualified to have access to that? And it becomes beyond, more than just a political or even a scientific process. We do work in DIY medical technology, and in many parts of New England, that would be considered a pariah research approach. But 15 years ago, that was same set of other technologies that people are now doing in their backyard. So it's the question of regulation always assumes that there's always a body of people that know better, and it's always safer to assume that there's, I think, a larger tenet that gives certain amount of ethics and decency, or perhaps better, a belief.
I think we can give some specificity to this. Regulation, if we're talking about writing laws that specify the conditions under which a practice can take place, what kinds of bona fides have to give, what happens when some untoward event or negative outcome comes, it's quite technical. And there is place in the system for lay people as well as experts to make comments and to get their interests and their concerns put into the process. So let's not jump from the notion of regulation to, oh, there's some little elite telling everybody else what to do.
Yeah, I completely
That's
agree with
not true.
Let me take one or two questions that are more personal to
is.
individuals. Here's one for Professor Picard. How do you reconcile God's love with really difficult situations like autism or the Holocaust?
Real easy questions here, huh? I have no problem reconciling God's love with autism. I know wonderful people on the autism spectrum, and if anything, I think I and their families, we experience God's love in an even deeper, more profound way through knowing them. They have a lot to offer and get us to think on our own humanity in ways that I think deepen and enrich our lives. So no problems there. The Holocaust is definitely troubling, and it's, you try to figure out what went wrong there. We're not going to do this in 2 minutes. But I was reading this fabulous biography of Bonhoeffer. I don't know if anybody here has read Eric Metaxas's biography of him, that was giving a bit more insight into what was going on at the time. And it was just fascinating to me to see people putting so much faith in a man and an ideal that was so very clearly against the values in the Bible that honor all human life equally, and how misled people were by their desire for something different there. So it was very clearly against Christian teaching, despite some wordsmithing that Hitler did to try to get through some things he had to get through.
Okay. All right, here's an easier question. This is for Professor Barbastathis. What are the implications of invisibility?
Well, let me first say that the clock that we developed is not a very practical device at the moment. It is not something that you can buy and put on yourself and make yourself invisible. Its value is purely scientific. What we showed is that you can actually guide light in a certain way. You can make light behave in a way that was not known before. And namely, the way we saw it can happen is you can make light bend around a corner, bend around a wedge, go back down and re-emerge as if the wedge had not been there. That is the value of the invisibility cloak. It was a purely scientific development. I don't think you'll have invisibility cloaks in the supermarket anytime soon.
Okay. All right. Let's take this one. Why do you think the world needs saving? Personally, I think the world is fine the way it is. I think that's kind of your view, right?
That's George's view.
Yeah, that's George's view. Anyone else want to tackle that one?
Wow.
Why does the world need saving? Personally, I think the
because
world...
it's getting
That person-
warmer. It's getting warmer. The seas are going to rise. That's why.
Well, I wouldn't dispute that. Actually, I agree with you that there is scientific proof that this is indeed happening. By saving, perhaps what I interpreted this word to mean is something more drastic. For example, some sort of science fiction scenario of a comet, flying onto Earth, and we have to send Bruce Willis or one of these people to save us. I think the world is in a dynamic balance right now. It does not appear to be in any imminent danger of destroying itself. Of course it can happen. Of course we can manage it. And from that point of view, I don't think so. But whether the world may be getting worse or diseases may be getting worse, certainly that is the case. And then I think technology has something to do with improving some of these conditions, and whether combating disease or even saving us from global warming if we play our cards right.
I just add, there's horrible evil, right, in this world. It's the biggest question everybody has when they talk about God, right? And the world doesn't look like it's getting any better on its own. We see entropy increasing. We see all of us who try to do our best, and things just getting, we can't be.
Do you think it's worse than 900? Do you think it's worse than when half the population of Europe died during the Black Death? Why is it worse now for evil? All the people...
I don't think she said it was worse now. She
just
just said
said
there was evil, okay.
I said there's evil, and there are lots of, it's not getting better.
Did I hear that entropy is evil and that increasing entropy? Because
No,
as far as I know, that's the second law of
Entropy's
thermodynamics.
There's more disorder. There's increasing,
that's the
things
second law
aren't
of
becoming more
thermodynamics.
order and things
Well,
aren't
then
becoming better.
that's
I think if the person
When
that
was-
asked the question left maybe Cambridge and traveled to one of these countries, they would reassess the value of the question. There's tremendous suffering around the world, and maybe it's not as bad as 900, but when you compare that against the resources that we had in 900,
then that's a question of distribution.
It can be.
I absolutely agree with you. I
But
absolutely
it's not
agree with you.
just
And the
that.
decisions about distribution, how should they be made?
Go ahead.
That's
Finish your
what I
thought.
worry
Finish
about.
your thought.
It's also policy.
I
That's
think
what-
that there's
that is policy.
it can be largely about policy, but if it gives us a pause to go out and try to deploy things that can affect the world in a positive way, instead of saying, well, sitting back and say, well, the world doesn't need saving, I'm just going to make kitchen appliances for yuppie people in Manhattan or something, then frankly we could use our engineering skills for something a lot more fun than trying to save the world. And
Well, I don't think anybody here disagrees with that. The question, I think we all agree that we would like people to be less poor, to be healthy, that to have more policies that make a better life for most people. I don't see any disagreement here. I just don't see where Jesus Christ has anything to do with it.
Okay, well, let's ask a question that changes the subject, but is along those lines. Is there, George talked about the manual. We don't read the manuals, okay? Is there such a thing as a manual for the world or for humanity? I think we've heard clear answers from two of you that there isn't, okay? But I'd like to hear from the Christians about whether there is a manual, the extent to which that manual works, how does it work?
for me, that manual absolutely is the Bible. It's worked for hundreds of years. It continues to work. And sure, a lot of people will argue that it stands for war and other misrepresentations of Christianity, but I think a far much larger representation of Christianity will tell you that it's served to promote love and faith and hope in the world and inspire others to even pursue science and back science.
And stoning adulterers.
What did you say, George?
And stoning adulterers.
Yeah, stoning
That is written
adulterers.
When was the
explicitly in
last
Bible.
adulterer stoned by Christians?
It's in the Bible. It worked for hundreds of years.
So what sort of a manual is the Bible? What sort of a manual is the Bible?
Yeah, so the Bible includes a lot of historical record of what happened. It also includes the words of Jesus, which I think are more of a manual for how to live. I mean, and I listen to your philosophy, the things you've espoused for how to decide what's good come from the words of Jesus. You know, loving one another as I have loved you, all people being loved equally, all rights, all lives having equal value.
He didn't talk about rights.
These, well, he didn't use the common parlance.
He didn't talk
of
about rights.
But, you know, at a time, for example, in his society when women were treated very poorly and all kinds of bad things were done against women, he treated them with enormous regard and respect and talked to them. And there's just beautiful examples of him sort of going against what was common in society and setting an example that I think is a manual that I find incredibly inspiring.
Any comments on that? Okay. Technology often distances our actions from the consequences, this question says. It's psychologically easier for us to kill one another by pressing a button than it is to commit cold-blooded murder. How does technology itself shape our understanding of human decency and value? This might be a big question, but anyone want to tackle it?
Well, since I talked about decency, I suppose I must confess that technology can have a great distorting value of what decency is. For example, people getting trashed on Facebook or Twitter and then going on to commit suicide. So technology can have some horrible effects, and I will completely agree with Suzan on this one that if used in certain ways, technology can actually do the opposite, create a very unethical, uneven, and even murderous society. So it can also be used for good, but we have to understand its limitations.
But I think Suzan was saying more than that. She was saying that technology is somehow changing our view of what it means to be human. I think
that's what I was saying, because I think what George is saying and what I hear other people saying, it's the uses to which technology is put. I think that's correct. They could be good uses, they could be bad. There's nothing inherent in most technologies that's good or bad. And the kinds of logic and the science that goes in to making a technology cannot tell us what is good or bad, only what's more or less efficient. And that isn't a definition of decency. And that has to come from somewhere else. And so technology can undermine the capacity for a loving, decent, consensually participatory life if we think that the only way to know things is through this kind of means, ends, calculable logic. And that's the limitation. But that, having said that, and I thank you very much, having said that doesn't mean you have to, or there's nothing logically that follows that you have to imagine some super divine presence as the alternative. That's the place I stop.
So I think then we agree on many things, which is that some of the values that we hold do not come from a technological or scientific analysis.
Absolutely.
But our differences perhaps are in that some of us think that some of those values represent something beyond the natural, and others of us think that perhaps it doesn't. They don't represent things beyond the natural.
If I may, I don't think any values come from technology, in fact. The values we have come from our evolution as human beings and how we learned to coexist with each other in a covenant. And I realize that some of these were developed through religion over centuries, but my thesis is that religion wasn't the necessary factor. My theory is that, or my thesis, I should say, is that the human decency can exist without religion and without the need for a divine being to impose
that might
it.
be true. I think, though, that technology these days has an immense power, which Neil Postman would call something like technopoly or something like that. And that is certainly something where I think we as a society look round and look for ways to find foundations on which we can build, let's say, bulwarks against that kind of...
And a total agreement.
Yeah.
Total agreement. We are in search for these ways to form a community that can contain the things we have made. We're in total agreement on that. My position is that if you invoke something like religion or like Jesus, you are invoking something that is not going to get us all in the same place, because we're not going to agree about that.
Well, that's a position, but it's certainly the case that for a
necessary
vast
either.
fraction of the world's population, religion is in fact where they derive their ethical values from, whether you like it or not.
That is true. That is a observable fact. And I would have said before that religion is very important to people. I would be a terrible sociologist and anthropologist if I didn't know that. But that doesn't mean...
And I'm sure you're not, okay?
But that does not mean that because it's important to people, that it is necessary for understanding the world.
Okay. Is there such a thing as enough technology, or is there even such a thing as too much technology?
Well, there are some very good books on this. For example, sorry.
She always gives us reading assignments, okay?
Well, it's the problem. So, for example, in Charles Perrow's book of a few years ago called The Next Disaster, he argued that the technologies, the complex technologies that we have created, have gotten so dangerous that we cannot afford the consequences of an accident. Not that, because we cannot prevent every single accident. And he says in that book, so let's not do some of them. Not because they're not possible, and not because 99% of the time they won't work well, but that 1% may be too much. Fukushima, as an example, perhaps, or Chernobyl. Maybe the damages are just too much, he was saying in that book. And so maybe some technologies, things we are capable of doing, we can or should, depending on how you want to argue this, you want to say it's possible, but we collectively decide not to do.
How do we make that collective decision? Because we're not very good at resisting technologies. Right now, it seems to me that we very rarely resist technologies. Are there technologies we should resist, would you say?
I think you have to look at the context and who's designing it, who's deploying it, who's going to use it, and understand that a lot of times the people that use it are not the same people that choose the technology in the context. We see examples of ultrasound, of life-saving technology today that's being deployed sometimes in developing countries, being used specifically for abortive decisions in India, for instance, when the fetus is a female. And some may argue, well, we can limit the amount of ultrasounds, and then that has its own consequences. Throttling back technology or pushing the accelerator button on the R&D effort is not the question I think that needs to be answered. But instead, what is the intent, and how do we formulate better intent and guidelines for those technologies? And I don't actually think it is about consensus. We have a long history of consensus, and it can also lead to some pretty bad things.
Okay, but for example, if we think about, let's say, the Bible talks about, for example, the Sabbath and resting from work. So it seems to me that might imply, for example, that there are certain types of activity which we should refrain from. We shouldn't reap our fields right to the boundaries, for example. Do you think those kinds of things are Christian scriptural injunctions to refrain from technology, or how would you interpret them?
I think that just like anything else that we can do, just the simple act of accessing and developing technology can also be something that we can refrain ourselves from. I think we just have this fascination with innovation and invention that, as I mentioned earlier, the act of solving something for oneself, just that sheer moment that you thought of that you're solving the problem, makes it hands-off territory for you to prevent me from doing that. And that's what gives rises to really fancy missile guiding systems and that sort of thing. Okay.
May I tell a short story about arriving in Jerusalem on Shabbat one Friday, checking into the hotel, getting a room on the 9th floor or something, lots of bags. It's the Sabbath, so you're not allowed to push buttons and you're not supposed to do work, right? Lug your bags or go up the stairs. They used technology. They had an elevator that was running all the time between all the floors so that you didn't have to push a button. You didn't have to do any work. The technology helped them, in fact, keep the Sabbath.
Great.
Okay, fine. Okay, so I think everyone here feels perhaps a certain sense of responsibility with respect to their technology. You know, how does that pan out for you? How do you feel responsible when you're developing, for example, technologies associated with affective computing? Could you share that a little of that with us?
Yeah, I think there's a huge responsibility. I think all of our technology, while I would pursue it if I didn't think the good outweighed the bad, I think it's critical that we try to imagine what the potential bad uses could be up front, and don't just do that ourselves, we technologists sitting around saying, what are the horrible things that could happen, but also engage people who have very different perspectives from us. I also believe in praying about these things because with all the people I can engage and all the technology at our disposal to get feedback, I think sometimes we can still be swayed by things that might not be, take into account the ultimate source of all knowledge. So I know you can't disprove this source that I have evidence for and experience of, and I'd be happy to share all my evidence.
I can't disprove it, you can't prove it.
Not in a scientific way. However, there is enormous other evidence that one could provide. Yeah. So I do think that it is imperative upon us to be responsible and to go beyond just our own human thinking.
What if you found out that somebody was using one of your affective technologies as part of torture for terrorists, suspected terrorists?
Yeah, actually, this is one of the scenarios we've thought through. And we have, while we can't prevent all things, we have actually designed in some ways in which people could fake the signal, take the thing off, and not participate in wearing it easily if there were harmful things being done.
If they're in prison? If they're, up in chains and they've got one on?
I cannot prevent people from torturing other people. I wish I could.
Okay, George. So that in the end you make a cost-benefit analysis.
And I don't claim our technology
but
prevents people from
But in the end you made a
tortured.
cost-benefit analysis as to whether there would be more good or more harm from your technology. It's like what everybody else in capitalism does.
I'm not sure where you're going. I mean, I can't prevent people from torturing people who use PCs either, right? I mean,
So it has nothing to do with religion. Has nothing. Religion can say nothing about that. Cannot govern it.
It can say that people have this evil tendency, and we can't deny that.
I don't think we need religion to see that people are evil. That people do evil. There's a case going on in the Boston courts now of family and friends who were shot on the streets in Dorchester last year, made naked, said to lie on the ground, and shot. Do I need to believe in Jesus Christ to know that that's a bad thing to do?
You want to jump in?
But if you believe in Jesus Christ in other parts of the world, you'll recognize that other parts of the world will find that behavior completely normal.
Yeah, who's to say that that's right or wrong?
What?
You'll find that other parts of the world will see that behavior as justifiable.
Where?
To shoot?
To shoot?
Look what happened in Cambodia.
Look what happens in honor killings all the time.
Yeah. I was going to ask George the same question.
On the basis of religion. On the basis of religion.
I was going to ask.
That's a religious activity.
But you can't claim it's a Christian religion.
No, but it's a religious activity and a belief in a one God.
There are some wrong beliefs out there.
So then,
Okay. So George, I was going to ask you the same question about the potential of technology and in your area, for example, in optics, can there be too much technology? Can it lead to evil? And what should we do about it?
Well, I confess I do not have a good answer to that because that does not even have to do with whether it is high technology or everyday technology. Someone can make a toaster oven, which is a very useful device, but it can burn your hand. It can also set your house on fire. So I do not have a good answer.
So you don't think much about this in your own personal research?
Oh, you do. I mean, you certainly feel responsible, and you do. But it cannot really change the way you behave as a scientist.
I mean, you made the point. You made the point that a lot of research in the U.S. is funded by the military.
Correct.
Does that? I mean, I don't know whether your own research is funded by the military,
quite a bit, yeah.
But does that ever trouble you or give you pause? I mean, you seem to imply that that didn't worry you, but I'm wondering why wouldn't it worry you?
Yeah, so that's a very difficult question, which many of us face, and in fact, I do know colleagues at MIT who refuse to accept military funds. I am not of that opinion for the reason that the end goal of military research very often gets way overcome by the outcomes of military-funded technology. It is a cliche again, but the internet, the laser, well, actually, no, the laser was funded by telecommunications users. The laser, for those of you who don't know, was developed at Bell Laboratories, and it was a result of a monopoly rather than a military technology, which we also perceive as evil nowadays. AT&T simply had the monopoly of the US telecoms market and was devoting 1% of its net profit to research, and this is where the laser came from. But anyway, yeah, the internet was definitely military technology. So it goes back to what I said before. No matter who paid for the technology, whether it was the military or the National Institutes of Health, in the end, what matters is whether it will be used with decency and whether there will be ways to contain the unintended consequences. Now, having said that, there is certain places where I would never accept money from. For example, Saudi Arabia. There's many colleagues at MIT who actually receive money from Saudi government to do very good things, to do research on clean water and desalination. I was specifically asked to participate, and I said I'm not going to touch, for the simple reason that Saudi Arabia executes people for being homosexual.
Okay.
And I declined.
Okay.
I would not accept money from Pablo Escobar, the drug lord,
okay.
if he wanted to fund.
Okay.
So there is line.
Thanks, George. Okay, we're coming to the end. So I had one question that I wanted to put to each of the panel individually. And really, we have only time for a very, very short answer. So I'm just going to ask you all the same question. In a certain sense, we've all admitted at some level to the limits of technology and so forth. If that's the case, if technology is limited, and if in the end, perhaps technology will not save the world, wherein lies our hope? That's the question that's been put to us. George, you want to take that first?
Ourselves, our shared decency as human beings. That's my answer.
Okay.
Absolutely beyond ourselves. Our belief in a Christian God that has already saved the world, and we're just waiting for him.
Susan.
I think it's in the youth of the world. It's the future. You've got to save us from the mess that our parents and we made.
Roz.
In the youth, in ourselves, but all of us informed by one who knows much more than we do and who loves everybody in the world.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're coming to a close. I want to thank our speakers very much.
And yes, we do appreciate our speakers, but let's also give a warm hand for our moderator who's led us in this thought-provoking Q&A session.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.